Okay, so stepping in and pushing is an essential skill in Yiquan. It's one of the most useful skills that we can develop. You don't often see it, and that's because most Yiquan people, when they're demonstrating pushing, they're demonstrating it from push hands, and as we've discussed before, that keeps you closer to the opponent. It artificially takes away that point where you have to bridge that gap. Whereas stepping in and pushing is something that you would do in a much more live environment when you're further away from the opponent, and so you have to close that gap, i.e. it's something that you would normally do, for example, in sparring. Most Yiquan instructors that you would encounter on social media who actually share video footage of their training don't do sparring. So it's not a skill that they would necessarily need to learn about, and if you don't do sparring and you don't have that overall context of the reality of fight training, remember, it's not about fighting, it's about fight training. It's about the honesty of the training, of using that as the compass point. Otherwise, how would you know what kind of thing you need to be training? It's very much like, imagine running a business but not knowing the price of anything. Running the business might well be much more than making money for you. It might be a dream. It might be something that you love doing. It might be something that you have to do. But if you didn't know the price of anything, then that overall context of making the books balance and making a profit wouldn't be there, and the overall enterprise ultimately is just going to go bankrupt. So similarly, how do you know what you need to train? How do you know what should be on your training regimen? That's why we use this idea, this guiding star of the reality of the context of the fight. So it's not about fighting as such. It's not about, well, we've rehearsed all of that stuff before, but it's not about being obsessed with violence or anything like that. It's just about, how do you know what kinds of things you should be training? Just like running a business might not just be about making money, but for there to be any point to it at all, you have to understand, well, what are the prices of things? What should you be buying things at? What should you be selling things at? So on. And that influences the way that you train, or more than influence, it should absolutely structure the vast majority of your training. So once you realise that you need stepping in, pushing, then you realise, well, you need to practice that, and you need to practice hitting an object, because hitting an object, as Wang Shengjai says, it changes everything, and it's where the laws of physics that are involved in each one come into play. And this is something that Wang Shengjai himself says, until you actually hit something, you can't feel all those effects, like a compression set, for example, or infecting the opponent's structure with imbalance. You can't feel those things until you start doing them at a higher level of power and speed. So as part of your scientific approach to training, you break everything down, and the next thing you need for pushing is to start hitting something like a punch bag, a heavy bag, stepping in and pushing. If you don't do that, then you don't have the essential skills, and even if you then do try and bring it into sparring, it's not necessarily going to go well. So I saw a very good example recently. It was quite an old video, but someone had reposted it. Quite a famous Western Yiquan instructor doing a kind of a completely legitimate drill, which was kind of semi-live, and that's a very good way to train, semi-live. And there was no head punching, but there was body punching. And as part of this, they're doing a kind of like a sparring drill, building up towards sparring. And as part of this, this instructor decides to do a step-in double push, and it goes completely wrong. He nearly falls off the floor. And we've all done that, because nothing ever goes perfect all of the time. You know, the template postures don't carry over 100%. The sparring itself is often ugly and things go wrong all the time. And again, Wang Shengjai himself talks about that. But I watched it back a couple of times and I thought, just looking at the way he's tried to set the posture, he's not practiced on a punch bag, he's not practiced on a heavy bag, he's not spent time, diligent time, working on how to do this posture correctly. And you just cannot get away with that, because he sets the posture far too early, and then he tries to lean all of his body weight over into the push because the other person's too far away. He's misjudged everything. It might be a misjudgment, but it looked to me very much like that's somebody who's not practiced that posture, and then they've just suddenly realised that practicing something on the air means that the target is always within absolute perfect range, and you set it and release force at exactly the same time. But actually, in reality, if you haven't timed it right, very often the target is further away, and that's one of the things that working with the heavy bag can act as an intermediary step for, helping you judge that intuitive distance. So the first thing that we need to understand that we're trying to do with a step-in posture is to time everything correctly, and also keep in mind what I've just said, that sometimes things happen. The opponent moves in, the opponent moves further away, or you just get it wrong in the stress. So it's not always going to be perfect, and it's not always going to look like, in fact it hardly ever looks like, the template posture. And that's where you get these humbugs who watch you and say, oh, that's just, that's rubbish or whatever, because they don't spar, so they don't know. They imagine in their heads that they're going to do this kind of perfect thing. Not that they actually can do any kind of perfect thing, even as a template posture, but they imagine in their heads it's going to be like a movie, and it's just not. And that's one of the things that you learn immediately from sparring. It's always going to be a lot uglier in reality than it is in your imagination. But the critical thing that we need to practice with a heavy bag, which gives us a target that's fixed in space, so it's going to act as an intermediary stage that helps us learn distancing. Eventually we're going to have to intuitively adapt that, and it changes, of course. Different kinds of postures are slightly different, and different kinds of angles are different, and it sounds like an enormous amount of things to learn, but it's only like riding a bike. If you started talking about all the different skills you need in riding a bike, and different kinds of things that you might encounter, different obstacles, riding conditions, things that might happen, it sounds like an immense amount of individual things that you need to learn. But of course, we all know, if you can ride a bike, that actually all of that stuff just develops intuitively, and it's exactly the same with each one. The only difference is, like a professional cyclist, we start breaking down those individual possibilities. And a professional cyclist might think, okay, well, I need to practice how to take this kind of corner better. And in exactly the same way, we think about things like, okay, I need to practice how to do the step-in double push. So a big part of the posture is going to be the starting position, so that the distance between ourselves and the bag is correct for the perfect template posture. And that's going to require a little bit of experimentation, and then recognition that in reality you're going to have to intuitively create that space and try and get it as close to perfect as possible, but it won't always be perfect. And from there, the key thing is to get everything timed perfectly. The way that you stack the posture, the way that, for example, when you step forward, you recognise intuitively which part of the step is travelling distance and which part of it is release force, farli. That's on the end of the posture, at the end of the step. So that's got to be timed perfectly. Then it's got to be timed with the set, and that's got to be timed and structurally stacked so that it interlinks with the point of the body that you're using to hit the target. And that's why we do it in stages. So we do it on the air first, we do all the postures on the air, get that perfect, and then we do it with a bag. We kind of intuitively recognise, after a bit of practice, the correct distance so that everything will be timed perfect. And then from there, you're just into the next step, which is to bring it into live training. But lots of pushes and things actually you can't quite do in sparring, because they are a little bit too dangerous in some cases. But that's the process, and that's how we do it. Okay, so we'll take a look at the step-in double push as the exemplar. I feel like I did film a lot more stuff than this, but I can't. I've got so much stuff filmed. I can't find it, but I know I've got plenty of stuff where I'm looking at different kinds of step-in pushes, but with like a punch after or something like that. So we'll get around to everything, all being well. Now, it's very important to remember all of your theory here. So first of all, a double hand technique is usually rear hand dominant. That means it's using close. So the rear hand is dominant, the lead hand is just in a supportive role. And that helps you understand how far you should be twisting the torso. So for a lead hand push, that's usually using open. So your torso is usually more bladed, it's more side on, whereas with a double hand push it's usually forward because it's like a cross, the rear hand is dominant. We use seeking step, so it's a leading step using seeking step. So remember, leading step means the lead foot goes first, the rear foot follows, while seeking step is the way the foot hits the floor, ball of the foot first. Most of the distance is travelling distance, but then we have what we call a distributed set. So as the seeking step hits the floor first, then the rear foot is going to do what we call a kickback rooting. So it's using a pivot root. You can't really do this flat-footed in the same way, by the way. So when people talk about pivot roots, some of the ways that they think about it is so primitive. Like, you need a kickback rooting like this to anchor the posture down into the floor so that you can push forwards into it, add a bit of extra force. And then everything's all about timing for the distributed set. So as the seeking step hits the floor, as the heel hits the floor, that's a really solid set. At that exact moment, that's the point where you're pushing into the, striking into the bag, but it's not so much a push, it's an explosive movement. Short, sharp, Farley movement. Set coincides with the hands hitting the target, but of course then the hands have to push in a little bit, and then the kickback rooting comes a little bit, like just a fraction of a second afterwards as the arms push through. So that's a distributed set. The set is it's not all in one moment, it's across a split second, and the rear foot kicks back slightly after a split second after the lead foot hits the floor and the hands hit the target. The only other thing to remember is to get the body tension correct. So you want enough tension to be defensive and hold your body up. You don't want to be floppy as you move in, but the more tense you are, the less speed you can generate with the posture. But at that split second when you hit the target, that's when you've got to tense up. But you don't want too much tension in your shoulders, otherwise it can cause an injury. So this is why we practice slowly, build up, and eventually intuitively develop the right feeling. Okay, the next variation is the step through push, where we use a crescent step where the rear foot makes a slightly crescent arc as it steps through and then into the push. So it's a variation. Watch carefully in slow motion first. Next variation is a basic switch step on the spot. Doesn't matter what you call it, it's the ability to do it that matters. And remember that you have to adapt these for different kinds of pushes, different kinds of situations. But anyway, let's look at it in slow motion first. So you could pretty clearly see there the way that the posture is set changes depending on, it always changes anyway when you add more speed and power. Everything changes a little bit from the slower template posture versions, but you could clearly see that the set was on the rear foot first. So it's still a distributed set, but because of the on the spot switch step, the distributed set reversed so that the rear foot hit first and then the lead foot. And these are all slight variations that you just intuitively adapt through practice. You don't have to necessarily learn them specifically. As long as you're being mindful of what you're doing, they'll just kind of intuitively develop for most people. The next variation is shifting round to the lead hand side. We usually don't shift round to the reverse hand side. You can do, but it's a little bit awkward. It's definitely worth having a practice, but the danger is it can just damage the wrist because it puts the arm on a weird angle. But usually we do this shifting round to the lead hand side, and that's positioning ourselves in, usually if the opponent's kind of bladed and facing us in an opposing stance, puts us in a better position to push against their weak axis. So usually it goes to the lead foot side. The set changes slightly because you've got to just do that weird leading step that moves round to the side. So the lead foot goes first, rear foot goes second, and it changes the posture slightly so that it becomes more lead hand dominant. And that also means that it weakens the posture, but the idea is that we can hopefully compensate for that by pushing against the opponent's weaker axis.